My name is Nitai Daitel, and I'm a senior program officer at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. I'm thrilled to be speaking with Silvia Lindtner and Melinda Liu for a timely conversation discussing the impact of China's zero COVID policies on China and the world. Briefly, Dr. Lindtner is an associate professor at the University of Michigan School of Information and associate director of the Center for Ethics, Society, and Computing. She's also the author of Prototype Nation, China and the Contested Promise of Innovation. Dr. Lindtner is currently a visiting scholar at New York University, Shanghai, and a fellow in the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Melinda Liu is one of the most experienced foreign correspondents currently living and working in Beijing. She is Newsweek magazine's Beijing bureau chief, a commentator on international relations, and a contributor to foreign policy, Smithsonian magazines, and others. She has lived and worked in Beijing since November 1998, returning to a city where she lived from 1980 to 1982 as Newsweek's first Beijing bureau chief. Thank you both for joining us here today. We have a short amount of time and a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. Starting with Melinda, I'd like to zoom out and establish where we are today to set the scene for our audience. What do things look like now in Shanghai as folks have been following the news and the unfolding situation in Beijing? Paint that picture for us.
Thank you, Nitai. I'm actually physically in Beijing now, but I have a lot of friends in Shanghai. And I got to say, between these two cities, I feel very, very fortunate to be in Beijing and not in Shanghai. Shanghai was the first major city to get caught up in this latest surge, and it really took them by surprise. They had many cases in a very short period of time, and as a result, the entire city went into lockdown. Some areas are still in lockdown and going into their 8th week, and there were nightmares in the early days. There were food shortages. There were people dragged off to central quarantine facilities. There were apartments broken into by authorities. There was like mass disinfection of apartments that people had vacated because they'd gone into quarantine. And so just like clouds of disinfectant over everything, including antiques, books, you name it. And of course, many of us have seen the video of a pet dog that was beaten to death on the street after its owner, some of them consider themselves parents, but anyway, its owner was brought into quarantine. Beijing has learned a lesson from the violent and vehement negative reactions to that, which played out a bit on social media. Much of it was censored, but it got out and it's on YouTube. You know, it's out there. So it's much more surgical. It's much more incremental here, but nonetheless, it's unsettling. And the walls feel like they're closing in. Somehow I managed to be really busy and running around, you know, I'm at large, but I also feel totally unsettled and claustrophobic all at the same time, and bored sometimes all at the same time. So it's a very schizoid existence. You know, the tale of two COVID surges, Beijing and Shanghai.
Certainly. And so turning to Silvia, you know, currently outside of the major cities, outside of Shanghai at the moment, what's the situation looking like in the rest of China? How are folks outside these, you know, the tier 1 cities viewing the urban situation?
Yeah, thank you, Nitai, for that question. So I was very lucky to have left Shanghai just a couple of days before its lockdown went into full effect, and have been traveling in Yunnan since for the last several weeks. First in the south, Jinghong, Myanmar border, where I was actually in quarantine then for 12 days, and then traveled north, Shangri-La, and now Dali. And I've had many conversations with people from all corners of life here, and across class, from the Didi driver all the way to the hotel and restaurant owner to the waiter. Everyone is really concerned about the economic slowdown that has really shaped everyday life here. So it's really affecting everyone here. So, and this was really fascinating experience because it seemed like I had escaped the Shanghai lockdown, and yet I hadn't escaped that, because the lockdown of this major city had clearly reached, in terms of its economic impact, quite remote corners of the country, in terms of tourism, in terms of travel restrictions. And so there's really a direct impact, you could say, of the Shanghai lockdown in the southwest of China, but also I'm still in conversations with people also in Guangdong, where I've been conducting research over the last 10 years, and then people feel it there as well, right? The other interesting thing, many conversations that I've had with people have revolved around how there's actually fairly little sympathy for people locked down in Shanghai. So many of you, I'm sure, remember that in the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, around the Wuhan lockdown, there was really a pervasive sense of being in this together and people sort of supporting one another. And some of this was, of course, documented in the diaries by Fang Fang and many others, or even most recently, Guo Binyang's book on the topic has covered some of this as well. And I was really surprised that this kind of sympathy for people in Shanghai is not present at all. So people really are sort of calling out Shanghainese for their sort of elitist attitude before this current lockdown. And so that's a common reaction that I hear as well, where people are on the one hand are very, worried about the bigger economic impact all of this has for the country as a whole. There's at the same time also this attitude of saying, well, Shanghai people should just deal with that and get over it. That's been quite interesting to witness.
That Wuhan spirit of the early 2020 is certainly we're in a different place 2 years later. So we've seen on social media first, short moments that are then potentially scrubbed away. Some videos with folks expressing their discontent. And the challenges of assessing public opinion in China are known. Can you either give us a sense of your pulse of public opinion at the moment among the folks that you interact with? How significant is this state of discontent with the current state of affairs? We go to Melinda.
Right. I think in China, public opinion does matter. Sometimes it matters in ways that you don't expect, but it still matters. And especially it matters this year, because these surges of COVID in China just happen to be coinciding with a very delicate political progression of events, which are, domestic political progression events, which have been very much kind of put people on edge, because you've also got the war in Ukraine, which is, so if you put together the pandemic, the war, and the delicate politics, it's like a perfect storm of what a Chinese leadership would not want to happen all at the same time. The domestic politics people expect, will culminate in a nationwide party congress in the autumn, at which President and party head Xi Jinping is expected to do away with the normally accepted term limits, 2 terms, and hang on for another term and maybe longer as head of the country. He's both the president and the head of the party. There's even some talk that he might take the title of chairman, which only Mao had. So this is not what he wanted to see. This is not what his team wanted to see. And I think the combination of political infighting, which would have been happening even under normal conditions, without a war, without a pandemic, without an economic downturn, which I haven't even, that's also very, very serious. It means that every little thing that can be criticized and then is criticized on social media, everyone's wondering, like, why is that criticism happening? Is it really that people, just ordinary people talking, or is there something behind it? Is there some factional infighting for which this little thing is actually a really big thing? And of course, it's opaque. So very few people really know. Those who know don't talk. Those who are talking don't really know. So I think that's why public opinion, we shouldn't be just ignoring it. You know, obviously in normal times, you've got like one protest in one city about something that might not be able to spread beyond provincial borders. That's not usually, you know, a game-changing thing. But when it's now, and when it's pandemic, which is affecting the entire nation, people shouldn't be ignoring it, and they're not ignoring it. And that's what makes it important.
When you both set the scene, you talked about the economic anxieties, those economic impacts that folks around the country are beginning to feel. And the Chinese economy already, as folks are saying, experts are saying, is in its most fragile state in the last 30 years, continues to bear the brunt of this crisis. Silvia, as you mentioned, you've spent over 10 years conducting research in the ethnographic research in Guangdong and factory owners and the kind of the way that China engages with the world in its export-driven economy. Could you talk a little bit about how that the economic impact is being felt both domestically, as far as migrant workers and college graduates are feeling the anemic job market, as well as these international ripples and supply chains that are affecting us here in the US and around the world?
Yeah, so I really felt this economic impact and how people are experiencing it quite viscerally traveling in Yunnan over the last week. So every DD driver complains about the loss of business. Some of these drivers sustain themselves actually by returning to some of their family businesses in agriculture and being kind of self-sustaining and kind of holding off to make money until later. And streets that are otherwise bustling with visitors and tourists are completely empty. It's a very eerie feel actually to many of these cities here in the province. Many restaurants and shops are closed, and often I'm like one of the few people going into one of these establishments. And there's some improvement now recently over the last week here in Dali. You see bigger tourist groups arriving again, but overall the city still feels like it's kind of in this hold. And the same is happening with some of my contacts in Guangdong, where there's this kind of sense of holding off and waiting things out, and people being very, very worried about what this means in the long term. The one thing that I thought I might share to also give sort of a sense of a public impression of this current state of affairs that maybe isn't sort of this typical image we have. I've been doing research more recently in very rural parts of China, so not just in Yunnan, but also in Jiangxi province and in rural Guangdong, actually, following a young generation of cosmopolitan Chinese who decide to leave the busy city life behind and go to rural China. So they're interested in eco-farming and sustainable living, even in spiritual practices. And I've been in touch with all of them while I'm also traveling in Yunnan, and I've met some of people who do projects like this here, and they are quite content. You could describe them as part of this broader sort of inwards turn of a younger generation that talks about Silvia Lindtner and the sort of overwork and exhaustion, the tech industry. Many of them have international degrees, even from America in the tech industry, and they purposefully leave that behind. And their work in these very rural parts where they've set up eco-farming communities and alternative educational programs, their work has been very little, been impacted hardly at all. So that's in stark contrast to my prior contacts in the global electronics production industries and supply chains, or even in these touristy kind of locations here in Yunnan. So two very different experiences with this younger generation who works in these kinds of rural parts and experiments with alternative ways of living. They're kind of feeling even affirmed that this was a good decision, right? That rural China is not only safe in comparison to the United States, but it's also economically, in the long run, profitable for them to do that.
Fascinating, fascinating. Looking forward to hearing more about your research. So going to Melinda, I wonder if you could speak about in your foreign policy piece really did address the longer term, potential longer term collateral damage that economically that the Chinese economy is going to be feeling waves of this, the change in the shift in the overall business environment with this lack of predictability as these so many downstream effects will continue to ripple across the global economy for years to come.
That's right. And I think we're going to be seeing an exodus of, you know, when it's possible, possibly a bit of a brain drain. Right now, if you're Chinese and you were saying, I don't want to be here, and I can go to, you know, I can go to university in X place in the West. Well, no, you can't, because the government for Chinese people has already said you must strictly limit your overseas travel. Tourism is not allowed. You've got to have a really good reason to go. You know, maybe, you know, an elderly parent needs medical attention, or you're attending a funeral or something like that. But you've got to have a good reason to be allowed to go. And I know I have many Chinese friends who say, well, I was going to go visit so-and-so or do X, and now I don't think I can go. The other category are couples of which there's one expat and one Chinese spouse. And again, you're not going to, you know, you're not going to split up and travel separately just because, you know, so you don't, you know, those people are not able to go. If you're an expat, however, there are a lot of people who've just had it and they are leaving. And one of the things that made me so kind of schizoid in recent weeks is that I've actually been helping move and pack and store and sell and buy and dispose of belongings of very good friends who've decided to call it quits. Some of them are leaving China for good. Others are leaving for at least a year. One guy says he's going to leave for 5 years at least. And these are people, many of them have been here for many, many years. And this is just the last straw. Now, it's not even easy for them. Flights are getting constantly canceled. One of the bans, you know, there are many banned activities in Beijing. One of the banned activities is moving house. So if you wanted to move your house into storage or sell all the stuff or ship it out, good luck with that. It's not that easy, but there's definitely an exodus of individual expats. Okay, now if you're a Chinese citizen, well-educated, well-employed, you might say, who cares? We don't need expats anymore. You know, I was here in the 80s, as you mentioned in your introduction. Definitely the feeling then was Westerners are very welcome. There was almost a sense of Chinese people needing them more than the Westerners needed the Chinese. Well, that has completely changed in the opposite direction now. The assumption is that Westerners need Chinese more than the Chinese need them. And okay, so what's the big deal? You know, individual expats leave. If their companies stay, if their companies employ Chinese nationals to do the top jobs, isn't that good? And yes, that could be good if they're qualified people. But you don't want to have a hermit kingdom. You know, we have one already. We know what that's like. That's North Korea. The head of the EU Chamber of Commerce, Jorge Vodka, he actually has put together a number of studies, some of them very downbeat, talking about market exit by not only individuals, but actual companies. And he thinks that, you know, a number of expats in the community of any major city make it more dynamic, make it more creative, make it more innovative, make it more entrepreneurial, and make it more global. To have those people leaving makes it less so on all those counts. And I think that would be unfortunate, not just for the expats who are leaving, but for China. I think it's a bad thing that so many expats are leaving. Beijing and Shanghai are hemorrhaging expats, and that's, these are only the people who manage to find a way out. When things kind of get a little bit more normal, we might see many, many more.
So switching tack, as we think about this, at the end of the day, we pay a lot of attention to the political and economic risks, as we mentioned. At the end of the day, this is still very much a public health crisis. According to a study released earlier this month by Fudan University, China risks a, quote, tsunami of infections if it relaxes its COVID restrictions, with as many as 1.6 million deaths, primarily among the elderly. More than 130 million Chinese age 60 and above are either unvaccinated or have received fewer than 3 doses, which puts them at greater danger of developing severe COVID systems or even death if they contract the virus. So why is this still the case? Why won't the elderly get vaccinated? Why hasn't the government made more of an effort to change this situation? Do either of you have any idea about these very hard questions that we don't know, certainly don't have absolute answers for?
Silvia, did you? I do. I have some thoughts, but why don't you go first, and then I'll follow up.
Sure. I just have a quick thought, because I was just reading this report that came out by Caixin Global early May, which asked exactly these questions, right? Like why vaccination rates amongst the elderly are still so low. And what was most interesting to me in that report, what stood out was that there's high variation amongst vaccination rates between the provinces. So for instance, I think like Jiangxi and Anhui, people over 60, the vaccination rate actually exceeds 90%, as the National Health Commission report said, which I was surprised by, versus then Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou is not even reported. And what the report then also mentioned is that one of the key reasons why elderly still don't get vaccinated is that they're still not convinced that they need the vaccines, right? That they believe some believe that they have some insider knowledge that prepares them due to their own prior work experiences or sort of their networks. And many also cite low infection rate. So there's no need to risk it. And then many people associate the vaccines with a certain level, many elderly associated with, according to this report, a certain level of risk, right? Perceived risks, adverse side effects. So I think that report did a really good job explaining it. I think it will be key for China's exit strategy, because you mentioned it briefly as well, right? To increase and improve the information campaign and improve vaccines amongst the elderly, amongst other things like therapeutics for treatments, as well as the continuous social management to not allow these waves to get too big. And one of the things, that this is not per se sort of tied to the elderly, but one of the things that I think will continuously happen over the next month and even years is this data-driven governance and experimentation with techno-driven governance that we've seen, especially in Shanghai, right, to manage these COVID waves over the next months. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later, but I'm curious what Melinda has to say about the vaccines amongst the elderly, if there's any other insights.
Right. I totally agree with you. And I see, like, again, several things conspiring together to create this weird situation, because in my conversation with, again, with Jörg Wuttke, the head of the EU Chamber of Commerce, he was like, why can't China just use some of the mRNA vaccines that have been created largely in the West, which are proven to be more effective than some of the Chinese-only derived vaccines? So there's number one, there appears to be a certain level of vaccine nationalism going on in China, where yes, they want people to be vaccinated, but they want them to be vaccinated with Chinese vaccines. They're a little bit suspicious about foreign vaccines, and it's also not a good look. Here's China, they're great, they're strong, they're up and coming, they're going to rule the world. Their vaccines should be the ones that Chinese people are taking. Fine, except mRNA vaccines, in light of the current Omicron variant, seem to be slightly more effective than the vaccines that the Chinese developed, Sinopharm and Sinovac type vaccines, or at least more effective when used as a booster for the other vaccines. In other words, if I got Sinopharm vaccination because I had no other choice, but I'm like looking around for where I can get a Pfizer jab. I've had one booster. For my next booster, why not get a Pfizer jab? It appears that the combination is stronger. And even if it's only in appearance, why not? If you can, if they're all vaccines, why not get what the combination you want? But mRNA vaccines are not available to the general public in China. The second thing is there have been scandals in the past, medical scandals, that would lead some Chinese to be a little skeptical of official shots, inoculations. There have been bad vaccinations. There have been overcharging scandals. So there is a sort of ingrained, really, is this really going to be good for me? And then the next thing has to do with an age thing. If you're really that old, like 80 years old, 90 years old, of course, you've probably got pre-existing conditions anyway. Your immunity is probably might be compromised. And so even the flu could kill you, much less the Omicron variant. But in addition to that, these seniors actually had experiences with plagues and epidemics previously. I mean, some of them would have known about the plague and cholera that broke out during World War II. Some of it initiated by Japanese biological warfare. And this wasn't even a communist thing. The Kuomintang government also tried to quarantine and lock people in and keep people from traveling. And but they couldn't, they weren't quite effective, and people just ran away. And I've been in parts of Zhejiang province where literally, the plague was breaking out in a place called Jinghua because Japanese soldiers had unleashed, had spread some viruses there through clothes and through wells, actually, well water, food, and other things they left around. And Chinese were starving, so they ate that stuff and touched those things, and then they became sick. And the KMT said, "Okay, everyone, you got to stay where you are." And they tried to force them to stay in their houses and things. And immediately, everyone just tried to escape. And one guy ran home to Chuzhou, which is in western Zhejiang, and that city got decimated. And even 10 years ago, parts of the downtown were just these beautiful family clan halls unused because the entire families had been wiped out by these epidemics. So these guys know what epidemics are, and they've had bad experiences with quarantine, so they try to evade them. And then the other thing is, which is the saddest thing of all, and Silvia, this is so interesting to hear you talk about the tech. It's not just the vaccine itself. In order for you to be able to prove you've been vaccinated, you've got to be able to own and know how to manipulate a smartphone. And I literally, just yesterday, I met a guy he's not even that old. I mean, he's like 70 something. And he's got a dumb phone, but he doesn't have a smartphone. And even though he regularly goes to get tested and everything else, the guy can't go very far from his village, because in order to go anywhere now, you've got to be able to show an app on your smartphone that proves you're negative, COVID negative, and that you've had a test within 48 hours. And it goes ding and it's green. And if it's yellow or red, you just can't go anywhere. And so, he was he was talking to me about he had a propane gas tank that he used to cook in his kitchen, and he was saying, well, it ran out of gas, and now I need to go and get it exchange it for an empty tank for a full tank, but I can't get into that store because I don't have a smartphone.
Right.
And so, you know, like, all right, so then what happens? Well, then you've got to get a relative to help you or a friend to help you. And then the whole guanxi thing comes in.
Yeah.
How many people are actually evading, you know, pandemic requirements because they've got a friend of a friend with a nephew who,
Yeah,
you know, can help you do something. Yeah, so it's a digital divide.
Right.
By age and also probably by geography. I think rural areas are much more likely to have this type of person because, you know, they don't need to go to a grocery store. They just pick cherries off a tree, apples, chickens, you know.
Absolutely.
They don't, yeah, right?
Absolutely. So Silvia, I wanted to just pivot one last, sorry, Melinda, we're running out of time, and I want to get to the role of technology and innovation that has been, you know, the application of these lockdowns in the COVID era. How, Silvia, you know, or how and if, you know, the advanced surveillance tools that have been deployed in the name of countering COVID, how do you think those will persist beyond, you know, into the post-COVID world, you know, when it does arrive? And this will be our last question.
Yeah, no, it's such an important question. So I really think that what we've seen currently with what Melinda was just describing, using various forms of QR codes and apps, and what I typically refer to as China's techno governance, you know, it's really been a test basically for how China will expand outwards from this current application of data-driven technology to managing the population more broadly. So you've seen these various apps being used for management of urban life, the movement of people, but also applying more recently, and this is what I've seen a lot also in these more rural agricultural contexts, using data-driven technology, so using sensor technology, right? And not just these apps, but these apps in combination with various forms of hardware, what is often referred to as 数字化 in Chinese, the sort of digitization of existing both various forms of life in China, social life, but also production, right? Agricultural production. So I think we really see currently this sort of test, like the lockdowns are kind of like a test, a laboratory for how these technologies might scale more broadly. And, you know, Chinese administrative apparatuses tend to not go away. So apparatuses of having people managed via apps, all the way from the arrival in the city to, you know, reporting your status or contact tracing for COVID, right, is really an enormous administrative apparatus that I think will stay with us for a long time. And Shanghai, of course, was particularly interesting here because it always sort of positioned itself as being sort of the leader in these kind of data-driven experiments over the last 2 years, right? Shanghai was sort of the city of pride to have managed COVID really well, right? And it was really interesting for me to experience when I was still in Shanghai before coming to Yunnan, how the city went from this period of partial lockdowns, grid management, right, where particular streets, 街道 or 居委会 were managed based on case numbers. And this was presented as providing a nimble data-driven approach to a dynamic zero COVID, right? And then this fell apart, of course, as we all know, and as Melinda was talking about it earlier, right? But despite this messiness that we've seen in Shanghai, we have seen so much additional, or because of that messiness, I guess, and because of that socio-technical breakdown, we've seen much experimentation with new apps coming into the life of people. So I know from my colleagues in computer science at various Chinese universities that students and faculty are prototyping their own apps that are used specifically for each campus, for instance. And of course, all of us know that in addition to Qiankang Ma, the health QR code, there was also Qiankang Yun and Hesuan Ma, sort of the app specifically for the test, right? So there was an ecosystem of apps, right, that sort of popped up, and then some of them didn't really work very well, or they didn't work for the expats or for the elderly who couldn't use, right? And so all of this technological infrastructure required huge amounts of labor right? The only way of making all of that work, even though it was presented as tech, high tech, was a huge labor force, not only of the frontline workers, but also volunteer workers, many of whom are women. So I talked with many of the women working in my immediate compound in Shanghai, but also outside, a lot of women helping to feed these systems with data, right? And I think that's too something that we will see continuously after this experience with lockdowns. I think these systems will stay, and the labor necessary to make them work will also be required later on.
Fascinating, fascinating. Well, we're afraid we've run out of time. There's still so much we'd love to speak about and dive into, and I guess we'll just have to continue to pay attention to your work, both Melinda and Silvia, as you continue to live through the Omicron wave in China. On behalf of the National Committee, thank you for joining us today in conversation. It certainly provided me with a lot to think about, and an additional texture and context to so much that doesn't always get through to us here in the United States. And thanks to our audience. We look forward to having you join us at a National Committee program in the future. Have a great day.